Welcome, everyone. My name is Caskey Jose with Bonneville Environmental Foundation. I'm a watersheds program director here, and I've had the honor to work with many of the partners who are on the panel today and others on a project funded by the Climate Resilience Fund called Treeline, which aims to link together nursery practitioners, restoration professionals, and researchers to think, discuss, debate, make plans, etc., around the complex challenges of climate change and woody plant adaptation and establishment. I'm going to quickly just welcome you and run us through some definitions and turn it over to Rowan Braybrook from NNRG. But before I do, to set the groundwork, we wanted to provide some high-level definitions of seed migration, range expansion, and species migration. So often when people hear the phrase assisted migration, their minds might go to the far right, species migration. This is the physical movement of plants outside of their ranges as a mechanism to adapt to climate change, to preserve that species. So it's a conservation action. But today you're going to hear a little bit more nuance with relation to the framing, and we hope that's a part of what you'll take away, that there's other ways to promote assisted migration. Maybe one that folks are already doing, whether they call it that or not, is the movement of seed sources climatically or geographically within a range. If it happens accidentally, it's not technically assisted migration, it's just probably plant materials collection. Range expansion is the conscious movement of seed or plant materials to more suitable areas that are just outside of their ranges. A couple other factors just to point out relating to assisted migration are physiographic. That is things like north side, south side of a ridge or a valley, slope aspect. Geographic, so characteristics that affect plant health and success associated with latitude, longitude, elevation. Edaphic factors relate to soil characteristics. And finally, biotic interactions that occur between microbes, fungi, plants, wildlife, etc. I'm going to put up the agenda, and while you're looking through it, I'm just going to quickly thank our co-leads on this project, Northwest Natural Resource Group, Nasika Wilamut and Loma Katsi, and just also thank the numerous researchers, extension agents, NGO partners, tribal partners who've been a part of this endeavor. We welcome any of you who are listening in to join us, and we'll chat in a link to our newsletter, and we'll have some tours in the fall, which we will share about in an upcoming newsletter, as well as other webinars. So with that, Rowan, thank you. I'll turn it over to you, and thanks again to all of our distinguished panelists.
Absolutely, thanks so much, Cass. I'm really excited for today's presentations and discussions. You know, assisted migration is a topic that always comes up in discussions around both forest restoration and climate adaptation. It's probably our most requested topic for a webinar. So we know it's a topic of high interest to a lot of people, and it's also a topic that could easily be a multi-day symposium. So we know that we're just scratching the surface, but hopefully today will be a really good starting point and launch point for continued discussion and exploration. So as Cass mentioned, I'm Rowan Braybrook. I'm the Director of Programs with Northwest Natural Resource Group, which is based in the South Sound. And for the first hour, I'm going to be a little bit of an MC, introducing our wonderful presenters and helping with Q&A. So we're going to get started with a series of short presentations, and as questions arise, you can share those in the chat. I'll be monitoring those, and we'll be able to get to a couple of them during the Q&A period. Probably not all of them, but we'll see. We'll give our best try. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce our first presenter, Dan Hines. He's the Restoration Projects Manager for Mountains to Sound Greenway Trust, which is based in Seattle, Washington. And he's going to kick us off with his presentation. Dan, can I pass the virtual mic to you?
Thanks, Rowan. Get my screen going here. All right. Yeah, so happy to be here. As Ron mentioned, my name is Dan Hintz. I'm the Restoration Projects Manager with the Mount Sasound Greenway Trust. Here to talk about our adaptive forest restoration project at Stossel Creek. So just like I said, really honored to be here. Really happy to talk about this topic of climate adaptation and assisted migration. I think something that obviously is really on our minds even more heavily after this past weekend with the heat dome that we all experienced here in the Pacific Northwest. So I'd like to preface this by saying this project is not purely an assisted migration project, but definitely relied on some of those principles to really look at how we restore a healthy forest for long-term habitat. And I'll get into a few more of those excuse me, details here in just a second. And I think we kind of decided hopefully this was a good kickoff because this provides a tangible example of how assisted migration and all three of those approaches of range expansion, seed expansion, and actual species migration can be used in kind of a practical application here. So I know we'll get a little deeper into some of the definitions in the next few ones, but hopefully this really provides something of an approach that can be, potentially easily replicable for practitioners and private forest landowners as well that are curious to just try to learn a little bit more about assisted migration and how that actually looks on the ground and in practice. So the last caveat I'll put out there too is, we started this project and there was this sort of idea early on is like, oh, we can publish some best practices after this, and very quickly, kind of shifted to this is lessons learned, and obviously this is still evolving in such a new field and new theories here that, that was really the takeaway. And there's actually some great resources with Northwest Natural Resource Group on their website about this project and some of the takeaways and lessons learned. So getting a little bit more depth than we're going to be able to here in a 10-minute presentation. So quickly for folks that aren't familiar, the Mount Sasound Greenway Trust, we are an environmental nonprofit that leads and inspires actions to conserve and enhance the Mount Sasound Greenway, ensuring a long-term balance between people and nature. So that's about a 1.5 million acre landscape that was just recently designated as a National Heritage Area, which is really exciting. Really kind of spanning from Seattle across the Cascades, Ellensburg, really along the I-90. So the star on the map is the location of Stossel Creek. It's within the Markworth State Forest in the kind of north part of King County. Stossel Creek is a tributary of the Tolt River, which is a large tributary of the Snoqualmie River, the broader Snoqualmie-Snohomish watershed. This project, the partners, just want to call out here, definitely driven by Seattle City Light, working with Seattle Public Utilities as well. They have a few similar projects within the Cedar River watershed, a few kind of pilot climate adaptation projects like this. As I mentioned, NNRG, and then representing the Greenway Trust, we really assisted with a lot of the implementation and on the ground work. It's a 155 acre parcel that was logged in 2012. So this is a nice little bird's eye view of it. You can see the tiny little strip of existing trees. Hopefully you can see my cursor, was a small buffer that was required to be kept along Stossel Creek within the site. So City Light acquired it in 2015 as part of their endangered species program, really looking at protecting, restoring, enhancing habitat for our threatened species of steelhead trout. So really, like I said, the goals are managing for long-term forest health. There's no plans of, any timber sales, anything like that. We're looking at long-term riparian health on this site. So then that really kind of, drives the questions around, what species, what genotypes are most suitable for the climate, we might expect in the later 21st century as this forest hopefully is becoming more mature. So those are really difficult questions, obviously a moving target, and it doesn't mean stuff we plant today that might be suitable later is going to do as well in today's conditions too. So that's where, we're looking at establishment, obviously, curious about long-term forest health and composition, and, even further down the line, what the, natural regeneration and reproduction on site looks like. But for this project and the time frame that, we have available is really focusing on that 5 to 10 year establishment phase for our seedlings. So we'll get into a few more details, but really we're looking at species, associated with drier, warmer Douglas fir ecotypes, and then actually starting to look at those seed sources as well. So for Douglas fir and Western red cedar, we were looking at sourcing seeds kind of from, our normal range, our local range, I should say, of Western Washington here, down into Oregon and even Northwest California. And we'll get into incense cedar as the one species that could be considered or should be considered species migration as part of this project. So this is just a quick table I just screenshotted to kind of give the planting plan or kind of layout of the project, and most of the information we could glean from working with nurseries here. So really as part of the project design, which I can't admit I was as involved with, so there's a lot of folks who can probably speak better to this, but really started off looking at the Forest Service seedlot selection tool to inform some of the climate conditions that we might expect in this area, and some of the seed zones that might be appropriate for Stossel Creek when we're looking at climate adaptation. So that was really what started it, but then there's the practicality of what's available, what size plant material you can get, and the time frame we're working on. This was a grant project mostly funded by the Wildlife Conservation Society. So we were working on a 2 to 3 year period. So for instance, coming back to the incense cedar there, originally the plan was to try to find Western red cedar at the southern end of its range, so getting into Northern California. And we would have had to have people collect seeds, contract grow, and get those seedlings to us, which just really the time frame and honestly the cost of that too just wasn't feasible for this project. So yes, to an extent, incense cedar is definitely kind of a surrogate species for red cedar, and that's a whole broader conversation about how well red cedar. I know there's a lot of concerns around red cedar die-off in Western Washington. That was not a huge motivation for that. It was also just kind of practically, what was available and what we could try for those projects. So you'll see there's 10 different tree, I guess species isn't maybe the right label, but Douglas fir, we have 3 different seed zones, and Western red cedar, 2 different seed zones. Next slide, we'll kind of break those out a little bit more. So as I mentioned, we have definitely some species that are non-assisted migration, our Douglas fir or red cedar, really looking at more biodiversity out there as an approach for resiliency. Grand fir and shore pine are definitely within their native range, but probably not super likely to have occurred on this site, or at least not that we've seen. Seed migration examples, as I mentioned, the Douglas fir from about central coastal Oregon down to California, and red cedar from central Oregon as well. The range expansion examples would probably be Gary oak and western white pine, both species that definitely don't occur in the foothills of the west side of the Cascades where this project's located, but are close range by and are generally well adapted with Douglas fir and drier site conditions that we might expect to see. So you kind of mentioned the incense cedar is sort of a substitute, or I guess you could say surrogate for western red cedar at a further south end of its range. And we did our best to kind of label these. The last couple slides, I'll get into monitoring here. Really redundant with flagging tape, and then also with little aluminum tags in all our trees. Because as I think most of you know, Douglas fir in California is a little seedling like this. Doesn't look dramatically different than the other Douglas firs from Oregon and Washington on our site. And obviously we want to track performance. So 14,000 trees were planted total, focusing on about a third of the site. A lot of it we are allowing for natural regeneration. Of those 14,000, we established 6 trial plots with about 150 trees, I should say specifically 150 trees per plot. So it's about 1,000 of the 14,000 total that we are going to be closely monitoring for at least 5 years to track seedling performance and establishment. Some of the data we're collecting, as you can see, some of our crews on the right there, David, I think he's on this call, so hello, David. But our crews have done the as-built monitoring. So this was right after trees were planted last February, right before the pandemic, kind of lucky timing there. And then collecting data at the end of the summer last year as well. So looking at mortality, height, vigor, notes on damage, that might be browsing. As you can see in the first title slide I had, we did put tree protection on all of these trees as well, and establish photo points too. We did talk about bud break as a potential monitoring parameter to look at winter damage and how these plants do over the winter with potentially some cold temperatures. Fortunately, that was something we determined just time-wise, budget-wise, and kind of some of the technical ability to analyze bud damage as something we did leave out of this project, but something that is definitely considered for some of the monitoring parameters here. And last slide I'm going to share here is really just year 1 results. And I guess I'll really just kind of caution to not to take too much away from this, knowing this is just 1 year, and want to kind of talk about just a few things that we observed, or you could kind of mention as lessons learned for this project. You'll see the Western red cedars definitely had the highest mortality or lowest survival. These did get planted in late February to early March. Ideally, we would have done that earlier in the rainy season to let these things get soaked in a little bit more. But that's just when plant material was available. So we really just kind of had to do that. We actually had a really warm, dry March, if folks kind of remember at the start of the pandemic there. Also, competition with native vegetation on site was a challenge. So grand fir, for example, is a bit lower than everything on there, but there was one specific trial plot where that really kind of skewed the data, where thimbleberry came in really, really densely. So we're actually looking at clearing competing native vegetation around these plants moving forward throughout the course of this project. So the vigor was also on a pretty simple 1-to-4 scale based on the amount of green leaves, needles on these trees. So really trying to look at the health as long with their survival too. So even survival is high, some of these trees were definitely looking a little better or worse than others, towards the end of last year's growing season. So really, really quick overview, hopefully just gives you kind of an idea of what a tangible project like this looks like. And I'm obviously very happy to be, contacted here after the presentation as well, to talk a little bit more about this and, connect with some of the great partners on this project too. So Rowan, I know you're on the screen there, so I think that means I'm probably at my time or just over. So, but yeah, thank you all so much again for having me here, and excited to see the rest of the presenters.
Yeah, thanks so much, Dan. And I also included a link just in the chat, which is a webpage that shows some of the information that you just shared, along with some more details. It looks like we had 2 questions already pop in the chat. One was around how do you calculate vigor? I think you started to get into that, but is there anything else you wanted to share about what that looks like?
I could share that out, but pretty simply it was on a, well, 0 being dead, a 1-to-4 scale. And I think there was pretty simple 25% thresholds of green vegetation. I'll say some of the pines that naturally kind of shed and browns from their needles might have been a little discrepancy. So keep in mind, this is still subject to the people collecting the data, but pretty simple parameters of how green and healthy a tree looks, and really trying to take notes on the leaders of our conifers as well, if some of those were kind of flagging. So some kind of qualitative notes as well, but yeah, happy to share the protocol.
And someone asked about the plans for longer term monitoring at 10 or 15 years.
We hope so, but right now we have a 5-year contract with Seedlot, so it's great that they're committed to that. And longer term, we'll kind of see if that becomes more infrequent, but still trying to do something over that kind of 10 to 20 year frame and longer. But the idea is it's set up to do that, but right now we're kind of looking at a 5-year window.
Yeah, and someone immediately followed up asking about 20 to 40 year windows. So that'll, we can always say there's high interest whenever we apply to grants for longer term monitoring. I know that getting those grants for longer term monitoring is always a little bit of a challenge to get that long term funding for that, because it definitely is. Monitoring is always more of a lift than we think it is.
Right, and I want that Seedlot to really investing in that too. So right. Thank you.
Yeah, that is one of the great things about working with a municipal partner, is they have long-term interest in the health of the area and are great partners to work with. One last question before we shift to our next presenter. For incense cedar, were there any legal or policy sideboards that you were considering removing as a species, or is that something that didn't come up?
I can't say it was heavily considered that I know of. Like I said, I wasn't as involved with some of the original kind of design and selection, definitely more involved with the on the ground implementation and now the monitoring. So not that I'm aware of, but I can't say that with 100% certainty. And it was a pretty small percentage, it was about 900 or 1,000 of the total 14,000 plants we put in at Stossel Creek.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Dan. And I know there might be a couple more questions coming into the chat, but perhaps you can keep an eye out for those and answer them directly in the chat as we shift gears a little bit to our second presenter, who is Brenda Clifton. Brenda is the Senior Restoration Botanist for the Skagit River System Cooperative and is based out of LaConner in Washington State. Brenda, can I pass the virtual microphone over to you?
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. Let me share my screen. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we are implementing seed migration into our salmon habitat restoration projects in the Skagit Basin. To reiterate, seed migration is when seed sources are moved climatically or geographically within their current ranges. And the seed migration that we do in my program is on a much smaller scale than the last presentation, in that we're just moving seed from within the Skagit Basin. I want to talk a little bit about my background so you can see where I'm coming from in developing this program. So the Skagit River System Cooperative is an intertribal consortium formed by the Swinomish and the Soxhawtl tribes. We're located in northwestern Washington and focus on the Skagit River Basin, which includes the Skagit River, the Sauk River, the Cascade River, and the Suwattle River. I'm in our habitat restoration department, and we mostly focus on salmon habitat restoration. We currently have over 60 projects that stem all the way from the estuary, the Skagit River Delta, up into the foothills as far as Darrington and Marble Mount. Our restoration goal is to get functioning riparian buffers on all of the tributary and main stem waterways in the Skagit Basin. We consider a functioning riparian buffer one that consists of woody vegetation, especially trees that can provide shade to lower temperatures and large woody debris to increase complexity of in-stream habitat. We do this by using both stock from local nurseries, about half of what we put in the ground, and we also grow about half of what we put in the ground in our own nursery that has about a 15,000 tree capacity. In thinking about climate change and how I can give our plantings the tools to best survive in these changing conditions, one of the things I am focusing on is genetic diversity. I am in no way a geneticist, but when I did research, here are some theories that I found that were relevant. So our planting health and resilience will rely upon biodiversity to tolerate change and rebound from disturbances, such as we will experience from climate change. So genetic diversity will allow plantings to adapt to environmental stress and change through plasticity and traits such as cold hardiness, bud set and break, cone release, pest resistant, etc. So genetic diversity is what is going to give our plants the tools that they will need to adapt to climate change. Interestingly, long-lived woody species, like the trees that we use in our restoration plantings, have the highest genetic diversity among all plant species naturally. Within these, the best predictor of diversity levels is geographic range. So for example, Douglas fir, which can span all the way from Washington to Idaho, already naturally has really high genetic diversity. Outcrossing breeding systems and wind or animal ingested seed dispersal also results in greater genetic diversity than other traits. So for example, black cottonwood, which is pollinated by the wind, also naturally has really high genetic diversity. So while these woody species have more variation within species and within populations than other plant forms, they have less variation among different populations. So for example, in a study that compared Sitka spruce in Alaska and Oregon, there was a lot of genetic diversity between trees on one side of a hill and another, so within that population, but there wasn't a lot of difference between the whole population in Oregon and Alaska. So what that says to me is that I want to make sure that when I'm collecting seed, I'm sampling from as much of the population as possible to try and capture that genetic diversity that's already there. So we have established the goal of incorporating propagules, our live stakes and seeds, from as many plants as possible over the entire Skagit Basin. We're also trying to collect seeds at different times, so we capture different phenologies, like when plants are flowering and seeding and hopefully bud breaking. And we're trying to collect from all the different microclimates to include isolated, disjunct, or marginal populations, which could contain rare gene pools. For example, areas that are super flooded or really droughty. In practice, the way I am trying to achieve these goals is to purchase stock from all the nurseries in our area. I know from working in commercial nurseries that it's more commercially viable to collect a lot of seeds from a few plants than a few seeds from a lot of plants. And so I'm hoping by purchasing seeds from different nurseries, I'm going to get seeds from different stocks, even if it is still within the Skagit County. I've also been communicating the value of diversity to these nurseries. I've had individual conversations stressing that I value lots of different seed sources and that I'm willing to pay more for that. And then we're also collecting seed throughout the basin for our nursery. We've hired someone to collect seed, and we formed partnerships with the same conservation landowners that we partner with to do restoration projects. They are allowing us to collect seed on their land. So we're trying to collect seed from as many sources as possible throughout the basin. This includes collecting seeds from outliers. So for example, Nookachamps Creek, which is right by the city of Mount Vernon, and the Skagit River backwaters into this creek every winter, and every winter it floods. And so we're making sure to collect seed from these areas, thinking that it may have some plants that are extra tolerant to flooding, which is something we expect to increase with climate change. We're also collecting seed down in the estuary near the Salish Sea. This is a screenshot from the seed selection tool. And you can see when I put in the middle Skagit as a planting area and hotter, drier summers as a climate change parameter, these areas in red are good sources of seed for the year 2071 to 2100. So you can see still within the Skagit Basin, if I go down by the Salish Sea, I can find some good seed for climate change. And then we're also targeting some of our sites in Darrington. There has been a lot of volcanic activity, and a lahar came down through Darrington, causing really well-drained volcanic soils in especially droughty sites. And so we're also targeting these areas for seed collection, hoping to get more drought-tolerant seeds for our restoration sites. So that's just a really brief overview. I think we have a little bit of time for some questions.
Absolutely. So if folks have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. While we wait for folks to add some questions to the chat, Brenda, I was wondering if you could talk about just what would you say like some of the biggest challenges are around the seed collection that you've run into?
Actually, my biggest challenge is, since all my plantings are in low-lying areas, a lot of those have been deforested. And so just finding natural trees, and especially conifers, that we can collect seed from can be quite challenging. And so when we're trying to collect from as many trees as possible, sometimes we're just not finding that many trees to even collect from in the first place.
Great. And it's interesting that both you and Dan both mentioned the Seedlot selection tool, which I added the link to in the chat when you were mentioning it. Could you talk a little bit about your experience using the tool? What did you find useful about it? What were some of the limitations, perhaps?
Well, something that's interesting is that you can change the parameters of climate change that you're looking at. And so I think that hotter, drier summers that start earlier are really going to affect my plantings, because I already know if we don't get enough rain in May, I have high mortality. But another parameter that's interesting, I think, is the cold that the trees are adapted to. And that historically has been one of the factors that leads evolution. And so when you put that in, suddenly just collecting in my basin near the ocean isn't good enough, and I have to go a lot further south and start getting seeds from Oregon and California.
Yeah, definitely a lot of factors that kind of change what that looks like within the tool and within the modeling. Rich commented that it was great to see the emphasis on genetic diversity, and it would be great if all parties involved, including nurseries, are transparent in what sources they are using and the number of parent trees, for example. And have there been certain nurseries that are really on top of that, where they are providing really detailed information?
I have to ask.
Yeah.
And some nurseries are placing more value on it than others, but I think all of the nurseries have the same difficulty that I do, of the nurseries that I've talked to, in finding source trees.
What information, asks Kelsey, what information would you like to see from the local nurseries about collection in order to increase that transparency?
I agree with the former comment. The number of parent trees would be really interesting, and where those parent trees are located geographically, because I find it less interesting if it's a stand of 10 trees than if it's, 10 trees that are all 20 miles apart.
And we'll ask one kind of last question and then shift things back to the chat box. Are you keeping track of the fire risk in the area? Dominique was wondering, for the areas with seed collection.
No, I haven't had fires in any of my lowland collection or restoration sites yet. They're all pretty far from forest lands and more in farmlands.
Thanks so much, Brenda. And we'll probably have a few more questions for you to answer in the chat, but we're going to go ahead and shift to our third wonderful presenter today, Scott Kolpak. And Brenda was giving you a little bit of a preview into some of the genetic focus of the next two presenters. But Scott is a geneticist for the Forest Service and focuses on southwestern Washington. Southwestern Oregon. I'm in Washington, you're in Oregon. So Scott, over to you.
Yeah, no, that's okay. Just very quickly, in the Forest Service, we have a lot of discussions about assisted migration. And certainly we are, almost solely working in the seed migration area. So we have a lot of conversations, a lot of, sort of tool development, seedlot selection tool as an example, working with those folks. So a lot going on, but as for the seminar, I was asked to sort of look a little bit at, species migration and just as provide some perspectives. So I will really present a case study about this. So, and I'll go into it now. So the previous, two presenters, did a lot of sort of looking, in the kind of seed migration and a little bit into range expansion. And, to a certain extent, some of this is scale. So for the seed migration, we're, moving things around within a species is distribution. That can be big, so that can be big movements, but range expansion, we're often thinking about just moving just beyond that point, but then with species migration, it's kind of a continuum with range expansion, but often, the driving factor is, we're moving seeds, far outside the species range. And often this is maybe because, there's some natural barriers to dispersal. So here's a picture of whitebark pine on the side. I'm going to present a case study about whitebark pine.
And Scott, I'm not seeing your screen. Could you reshare?
Okay. Yes.
There we go.
Okay, thanks for that. Oh yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, so basically the first slide, not much that you missed there, but just to kind of highlight some of the, sort of different definitions, which sometimes get in the way, but, focusing here, this talk on species migration. So the picture on the right is a whitebark pine, and I'm going to present a case study about whitebark pine. And this, through the work they did, they really looked at a bunch of factors, both ecological and kind of ethical. And the first four I'll kind of talk about as I show what they did and what they're doing. And then at the end, I'll just touch a little bit on sort of the last two there. So this is, well known, whitebark pine, is in steep decline. It's attributed mostly to, the biggest contributor is white pine blister rust, but it has a lot of challenges, including mountain pine beetle, climate change, and its habitat disappearing, and effects from fire suppression and other trees moving up into the tree line. So that really motivates kind of the, is the species at risk of extinction kind of question. And then, we always want to think about invasiveness, especially when we're moving different species. There's, a lot of people get concerned about that. So we got to be very careful. And, in the case of whitebark pine, I don't think that there's, intuitively a very big problem in it. I mean, it's primarily dispersed by nutcrackers. So, its movements even within local populations maybe don't move too far to begin with. And of course, with trees, there's super long generation times. I mean, whitebark pine, 60 years until reproduction, that might even be conservative. I don't know, but there's ample time to really understand if it's become invasive. And finally, even with sort of considering what we can do to help this species, there's going to be continuing mortality. So I don't think invasiveness is going to be a big problem. To inform how we do any kind of assisted migration, we really should look at models and then back it up with trials. So, we want to look closely at using species distribution models that would both sort of project, using where the species is found now, kind of figure out, is there other climatically suitable areas now that the species just has historically not got to? And also looking at, looking into the future, if we use those same climate parameters we learned from the current distribution, where might a planting be appropriate? So in the case of whitebark pine, this sort of picture on the right, previous sort of modeling effort, clearly shows, over, 30-year increments that, within the US, the distribution, potential climatic sort of niche of the species is going to decline, and actually, likely in tandem, the species will itself. So within the US, there's really a lot of projected loss. But as we look north over the border into British Columbia and Alberta, there's actually a kind of an expansion of the range up there. And so this kind of demonstrates that these two kind of pictures sort of demonstrate that if you take the climate estimates of where the species is now, and then project that into the future, you can see that these green areas are sort of probabilities where that species could exist based on where the climate will be in different time periods. And in tandem, a lot of these areas already have current climate that is suitable for whitebark pine, but the species just isn't there. So getting into sort of the real study that I'm presenting today, this was a study from McLean and Sally Aiken. And so they did this same kind of climate envelope modeling to really home in on where they would put in a set of trials to get ahead of climate change and understand how whitebark pine will do in different areas. So I'm gonna kind of go through this kind of quick, but it just kind of get to some of the key points. So they chose 6 whitebark pine populations or provenances, and they put them into 8 different locations in a sort of a common garden design in 2007, 2008. 2 of those sites, right around here at Smithers, are within the current range of whitebark pine. And then there were 4 sites kind of within the projected future range of whitebark pine, and then another couple sites which are weren't modeled to be in the range, but they thought there was good reason that it could do well there. This was a little bit of a different study because they looked at seeds rather than seedlings. This was kind of motivated by they wanted to mimic sort of the natural way whitebark pine regenerates, which is primarily by the nutcracker caches. And also similarly, they did sort of multiple, 2 seeds per like hole in the planting spots to kind of mimic that kind of the way the nutcracker does its sort of dispersal. And some of the bigger focuses of measuring was really looking at germination. And so secondly too, and I just to point out, there was thousands of seeds, and they also tried this sort of treated untreated, which was the treated was sort of a stratification of the seed, just to kind of see if that was important. I really won't talk about that anymore. Then they just kind of measured early germination, survival, and growth within the first few years. And then they did a remeasurement in 2017. So the key results for the initial study, which was reported in 2012, overall it was pretty clear that whitebark pine can be moved north of its current distribution, but it needs to be tracking snowpack. That's a very important element for whitebark pine germination. And what they actually found was that the highest surviving and maybe germinating too, but the highest surviving seedlings was all across the board. It was Smithers within the range, there's Hazelton just kind of north of the range, and even equally as well in the Hines site way to the north. Also want to sort of really, be clear that, all the way up through 2010, 3 years after germination, there was only somewhere in the neighborhood of 8% surviving seedlings. And that's not probably unexpected. I think a lot of us just think about doing regeneration using seedlings, and that's why we do these things. But it is good to note, 7 years later, there really wasn't much of a decline in that. It was about 7% overall. Germination was pretty good in all the sites, but those germinates did die rapidly and at varying sort of rates. At this picture up to this left-hand graph, it doesn't tell you a lot, but it kind of summarizes the germination and survival, and really just kind of suggests there was a lot of sort of genetic variation in those traits in that study. And there was a suggestion that the provenances from the southern warmer sites, did better for germination, survival, and growth, which is kind of the normal trend that we often see. But we're always concerned about the trade-offs with cold hardiness when we do those movements. And then finally,
Scott just wanted to share a quick time check for you.
Okay, almost there. Yep, finally, just that it's, snow persistence is a very sort of important parameter when it comes to whitebark pine germination. So finally, the last two kind of points here is, well, when we look at sort of biological interactions, and we, sort of home in on this other work by Clare Palmer, who will be speaking later, and Brendan, they kind of, really made the point, well, we need to think about where, the natural range of the nutcracker is, and really, get a feeling for it's really unknown how continued viability these populations were in absence of the nutcracker doing its job normally. And finally, the Palmer and Larson article, they did a really deep dive into kind of understanding some of the ethical considerations, both what is lost when the species is lost, it's a very charismatic species, and also the trade-offs when you move it to a new location where it's never naturally been before. And I can't speak to that work very well, but they took a deep dive and suggested that, on average, it's probably a good choice to move it. So that's the end of my presentation on this case study.
Great, thanks so much, Scott. And I saw a couple of good questions come into the chat. I think with a look at the clock, we're probably going to shift Q&A to the chat for now so that we give Deborah some appropriate amount of time to give her presentation before our break in a few minutes. So thanks so much, Scott, and definitely recommend checking out some of those questions in the chat because there are some good ones waiting for you. We'll go ahead and shift to our last presenter before the break, Deborah Rogers. Dr. Deborah Rogers is the co-executive director and director of conservation science and stewardship for the Center for Natural Lands Management, and she's also the research associate at the Department of Animal Science at UC Davis. So Dr. Rogers, over to you.
Thanks, Rowan. Can you hear me and can you see me and my presentation? Great. I've got to say, though, if you want to make up time, I'm the last person that you should expect to make up time.
No worries.
I'll try to be uncharacteristically concise. How about that? And, you know, I plan to say how delighted I am to be here. It's exciting because my full-time job now is not geneticist. It's a broader responsibility, but I'm so excited to be talking about genetics. And I'm so humbled because I saw so many colleagues of mine from my former professional life in this group today. So shout out to Jesus and Brad and Richard and Dominique and many others. Delighted to be here. I think now, having seen these other presentations, because we really didn't have a dress rehearsal, I think my role now is to be a little bit more of a generalist about genetic diversity and genetic considerations, possibly a bit of a provocateur, possibly even a buzzkill, in terms of just raising a few questions or putting it into a more general context about when genetic diversity is important to consider and what are some, as I've called them, implicit assumptions. So that's what I decided my role is here today. And many geneticists I know among you, but for those that have had a few years past since you took a genetics course, when we talk about genetics diversity, it's not one thing. I've characterized it here as being quantitative. That is, we discuss amounts of genetic diversity and we measure it in various ways. There's another component that we could call structure. That is how genetic diversity is represented across the landscape, you know, clinally or randomly distributed, or maybe clumped in some sort of theoretical construct we call populations, or having some association with physical environment. And then a third component I've just called, and maybe others have too, identity or integrity. That is, how do we characterize that genetic diversity at a certain place? Does it have biological significance in some respect? Again, what's the relationship, if any, with the underlying abiotic and other biotic characteristics? And that's important to keep in mind when we talk about genetic diversity, whether we're talking about amount, integrity, or spatial structure. So when we make a decision to select a certain seed source and move it around to serve our goals, and those goals, when we talk about just genetic diversity, it could be to enhance the resilience of a current population, or it could be to expand the range, as several speakers have mentioned. And so we could be intentionally moving it, if it's a coastal population, you know, moving it longitudinally in a westerly direction perhaps, or latitudinally in a northern direction, or an elevation, up in elevation. So those are some of the common examples that we hear about. But when we do that, there's a certain number of assumptions that we're making about that. Assumptions, unless we have the research and the facts behind a particular species and situation. And those assumptions are simply these. First of all, that there is a fair amount of genetic diversity in the species or in the particular populations that we're talking about. And Brenda mentioned some correlates. So we don't necessarily have to have specific genetic studies, although that's good for the species, but we can rely on some other meta-analysis to inform whether we are dealing with a species that is likely to have very little genetic diversity, in which we may not want to give this too much thought, or probably a fair amount of genetic diversity. Second implicit assumption is that the traits that we're interested in, those traits that we believe are related to climate change, and we want to serve and make sure that they're well served and well matched to the new environments that we're considering moving this population to, that those traits have some genetic diversity associated with them. They're not just determined by the environment, and also that diversity reflects some local adaptation. And then the third implicit assumption when we're making decisions that relate to genetic diversity and assisted migration is that we can identify that desirable genetic diversity. That is, we can assign a physical address. We can actually go out and find it. We know where it resides, and we can capture some of it and make best use of it. And then the fourth implicit assumption is that, as people have talked through with a couple of case studies, that we have the ability to match the location of the current residents of that diversity with this other place that we're going to move it to, both in space and in time, as was mentioned. Are we matching it to current conditions or some future conditions? So those are perhaps some very possibly obvious for many of us, implicit assumptions when we're considering the role of genetic diversity in assisted migration. And like some others, I'm going to illustrate some of those assumptions and maybe some complications with them with a case study in which I was involved a few years ago. This is not one of those high stature plants in the Pacific Northwest, but rather a tiny little annual plant in Southern California. And it's important because it's endangered, among other reasons. And we decided to do a genetic study because people were already, landowners and managers were already making the decisions to move this around putatively in the service of climate change, but without any genetic information at all. So we undertook to do just a basic, but multifaceted genetic study of this species, this little San Diego thorn mint. And we multifaceted because we did a common garden study to try and get at potential genetic differences in traits that may be important to climate change considerations. We also did an isozyme study. We started out with different approaches and ended up using isozymes to characterize selectively neutral genetic diversity. And then we also did a measure of ploidy. So these are just, I think you can see here, 3 different traits that we were looking at. And for each of the traits represented by these graphs, we're looking here at just 6 populations. As you can see, they're represented from west to east. And in the top one, you can see that there seems to be a longitudinal pattern from west to east. So maybe in that trait, we feel we have some connection with a climatic variable or some geographic variable. The other 2, though, don't show that same pattern, even though there are some genetic differences. So that's a first issue that we may encounter when we do a genetic study, that there's several traits that we feel are important to consider when we're moving things around may express differently in terms of the relationship with the environment. So we may be making choices about which traits or which patterns we think are most compelling in our decisions. And this is a bit more quantitative representation where we're now taking those same 3 traits, days to flower, number of inflorescence, and biomass, along with that measure of selectively neutral genetic diversity, the first principal component for isozymes. And we compared them, we correlated them with several climatic variables that we thought, this is very subjective, but based on preserve managers' experience over decades, we thought were probably most related to phenological and growth characteristics of this species. So mean precipitation, coefficient of a variation of precipitation, the maximum temperature during the wet season, and the coefficient of variation of the maximum temperature. And you can see by the different colors, shading in those cells, that there were indeed, the yellow is the most significant. So we did see significant correlations between some of those traits and some of the environmental variables. So that sounds good. That sounds like we made this discovery of a relationship between some climatic variables and some of these seemingly important traits. And that should give us something to go on in terms of our plan. But first of all, it's not cause effect, it's correlation. And also, all of those relationships aren't the same. Again, there's different relationships between these climatic variables and some of those other traits. So again, it may be a matter of determining our priorities when we're making decisions. And then finally, the third thing that we measured was, we did measure DNA to get a sense of potential differences in ploidy. We did this because we knew of other species in this family that were polyploids. So we just wanted to check this. And sure enough, it was a test that was certainly well-deserved, because we determined evidence of potentially 3 different cytotypes. We're going to call them tetraploids, diploids, and hexaploids. But we saw not only evidence of those 3 levels of ploidy, but as you can see, where each histogram here is a different population sampled, there's mixed ploidies apparently, or different cytotypes sometimes within the same population. And that can be an issue when we're moving plants around, because sometimes there are reproductive barriers between cytotypes. So it's just something of which to be wary. So wrapping up with not only some implicit assumptions when we're looking at genetic diversity, but also additional considerations. I've already mentioned ploidy. Invasiveness has already been mentioned by Scott. If it does too well, it can outstrip its, those moved materials can actually succeed too well and outstrip their former ecological niche. And then photoperiod, we talk about differences in climate, but the photoperiod is going to be something different. And it's an important consideration because it's a feature in which it may play a role in plant adaptation. Genetic diversity and associated biota, several people have already mentioned, and it's a mainstream consideration now of other critters that we need to sweep along with us when we move plants, but not only the other critters at the species level, but also considering that there's diversity, genetic diversity in mycorrhiza and the animals associated that we need to consider. And I'll just close with another example because there are so many assumptions, so much information, so many other considerations. It may seem a little overwhelming, but as we've seen today with other case studies, and this is just another one that I offer, again, from I think 2012, that was a popular year for important publications. This one concerning Brewer's spruce, where I think, again, the colleagues involved did a very good job of thinking all this through, the genetic considerations and the other considerations, and making some very well-considered plans. So in closing, definitely this conversation, it's a group sport, and I encourage people to reach out to others to help make your respective decisions.
Great, thanks so much, Deborah. And I haven't seen any questions in the chat yet, but I've seen 2 compliments for your paintings and the background of your slides. So
yeah, I just mentioned one thing, Rowan. This, I don't know if you chose it for this reason, but today is Canada Day, like Canada's version of the 4th of July. So I'm celebrating some famous, at least famous to me, Canadian painters.
Absolutely. Well, I'm guessing people would love a little bit of a stretch break right now. So we're going to, chats will be open if you want to share some questions for Deborah's presentation. We are going to take a 5-minute break and then come back for our interactive discussion on the risks and ethics of assisted migration. So thank you so much to this morning's presenters. It's given us a great starting point and a lot of information to chew on. And it looks like from the comments, people are chewing on some of the questions and points that you've raised. We're going to take a 5-minute break and be back in 5 minutes promptly to start our second part discussion. So everyone go grab a glass of water, stretch, and see you in just a moment. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the second hour. In the second hour of our webinar today, it's a little bit of a different format. We're going to be focusing on the ethics and concerns around assisted migration. The format's a little different because we have 4 great panelists who are going to be discussing these questions that keep arising around assisted migration, and maybe getting a little bit more depth into some of these questions that have been arising. So for the second hour, I'm going to be moderating the discussion and audience questions. We do want to keep this as conversational as possible, so I definitely encourage all of our speakers to address and respond to one another directly throughout the discussion. After some introductions, we're going to start with a couple of general questions to kind of lay the groundwork, figure out what some folks' positions are, and then we'll start bringing in questions from the audience. So please feel free to share your burning questions in the chat, and we'll bring a few of those questions into the discussion as we converse and move ahead. So I'd love to get started with introducing the speakers, and if each of our speakers could share with us the perspective that they're bringing to the discussion and perhaps something that struck them or that they found interesting about the earlier presentations. Deborah, since you were last in the first section, how about we have you be first in the last section if you'd like to share a little bit more about your perspective and interests.
Sure, thank you, Rowan. Well, my perspective has probably changed in the last 15 years when I went from being a full-time plant geneticist to be having much broader responsibilities in managing lands, and lands, in fact, that are habitat for endangered species. So I have some implicit biases now based not only on genetic considerations and the whole idea of you can't put the genie back in the box sort of thing, genes being so mobile, but also in terms of risk management, because I do work in the world now of endangered species. So there's very little margin for error in either direction, either doing something or not doing something. There's very little margin for error. Also because they are listed species, state or federal, I work in a highly regulated environment. So I'm also coming from a perspective of what biologists and conservation practitioners might want to do versus sometimes what we can do in terms of regulations or just our relationship with regulators. I learned so much and appreciated so much the comments from the other speakers, and just referring now to something, things that Brenda was saying. I found it so compelling because Brenda was really getting to not just the planning level where we can think things through so well and have so much information, but really the implementation is so important, understanding how materials were collected. It's all fine and well to talk about moving things around, but it's going to succeed or not depending on how things are implemented. And I know down here in California, the nurseries often contract out for seed collection. They may not even know where they come from. So I was really pleased to have Brenda point out the importance of having that relationship and encouraging nurseries to get information and provide it to the customers.
Great. So we can go ahead and introduce some of our other great speakers for this afternoon. Can go over to Marc Gauthier, who is the Wildlife Program Manager for the Upper Columbia United Tribes, which collaborates with 5 member tribes on land management in Eastern Washington and in Idaho. Marc, what perspective are you bringing to the table today, and what's something that struck you from this morning or from earlier presentations?
Thank you, Rowan. Well, I'm the Wildlife Program Manager here at the Upper Columbia United Tribes. And I think the perspective I bring is kind of wide ranging in that when you work for 5 tribes, there's a lot of perspectives. And I've done some reaching out to some of our foresters and some of the experts within our tribes to gain some insight from them. And there is a wide range of perspectives on this topic. And there definitely are some ethical concerns as it relates to the issues of pathogens and invasiveness, and the fact that tribes have lived alongside and in this ecosystem for, since time immemorial, and lots of change has occurred, and a lot of adaptation and tree movement has occurred, but it's done it within the capacity of the natural ecosystem. And so there's also a recognition that things are changing really rapidly, and there is a need to be proactive. And one of the tribal reps told me that it was their perspective that it would be unethical to not try to adapt to this changing climate, but that we need to do that in a real thoughtful manner. And so I think for me this morning, hearing more about some of the on the ground examples of the efforts that are underway is really compelling. And I know that I've personally wanted to see more of a best available science literature review of what exactly is going on in our region as a starting point. And I found it, I guess, kind of an ideal segue to one of the things I wanted to highlight based on another conversation I had with one of the foresters, which was relevant to the incense cedars. And apparently I've been doing some digging to try to find more information to share. But what I found in the story that was shared is down in Moscow, Idaho, several years back, there was an attempt to bring in incense cedars and in a controlled kind of experimental effort. And the trees did really well for many years, but then suddenly all developed cedar apple rust and all succumbed to that, and the trees all died. And so that was interesting. That was kind of an unforeseen consequence, but it led me on this little journey of inquiry to wrap my head more around this cedar apple rust, and come to find out that cedar apple rust has an alternate host that is commonly serviceberry, hawthorns, apples, and pears. And so to complete the life cycle of that rust, they need the two hosts, the cedar and then these other trees. And what they found is that not only can the rust be detrimental to the cedar trees, but it can also be extremely detrimental, in particular to pears and to the orchards that grow pears in the area. So just again exemplifies these unforeseen repercussions, and in my mind helps to direct us in a manner that is looking at these things in a controlled and experimental manner on the onset, and then learning from that before going to these full-scale attempts to change. So I'll stop there and see how much more time we have.
Definitely have some more time to dig deeper into these questions. Next, I'll introduce Dr. Clare Palmer, who is a professor of philosophy at Texas A&M University. Clare, what perspectives are you bringing to the table today?
Yes, well, I'm an environmental ethicist, so I'm not actually out planting any trees myself, although I do actually own a piece of land where we're trying to do a post-oak savanna restoration. I have some experience of trying to do these things, but my particular interest is in questions about values and ethics raised for conservation by climate change in general, and strategies like assisted migration are one of those areas that I think raised, some really interesting value questions, which I think we'll be talking about. Basically, what's been really interesting for me is hearing how kind of complex these ecological and genetic issues are. And I think for someone like me who tends to work at the level of thinking about values, often I don't get into the kind of depth of how complicated it is to actually do these things in practice. So that's been really interesting for me to think about. But I also think that the reason why people are engaged in these practices is a value-driven reason. The reason why people want to move seeds and trees is because they think there's really something valuable about preserving and protecting these things. And those are the kinds of questions that I'm thinking about. Why are we doing this? Can we really protect the things we want to protect by moving something, by even within range or outside the range? So that's one set of questions I'm interested in. What are we actually preserving by doing this? What might we be threatening by doing this? And what might we lose if we don't do it? What are the losses from inaction? So that's one set of things. Then the other thing I'm interested in is thinking about wildness or naturalness and what people think makes a tree or a forest wild or natural, and whether a forest that's the product of assisted migration might be thought of as a wild forest. And I think that people have very different kinds of views about what wildness is and why we should value it and whether we should value it. So that's something I'd be really interested in thinking about. And that was another thing that occurred to me listening to people talking earlier, is I was wondering whether there'd been any objections to moving seeds even within range. So you're not introducing something non-native, but I wonder whether there are some people who would say, well, maybe we should let things regenerate even with the worries about climate change, that actually just the act of planting something makes these trees artifacts in some way rather than being a natural forest, and the naturalness is what's important. So those are some of the kinds of questions I'm interested in.
Wonderful, thanks. And last but not least, our fourth panelist, Dr. Dave Shaw, who is a professor at the College of Forestry at Oregon State University. Dave, what perspective are you bringing to the table today?
Yeah, hi. Well, I'm coming from the perspective of a forest pathologist, forest entomologist, someone who studies tree mortality and causes of tree mortality and, unhealthy forests, I guess. Assisted migration is no longer sort of, a hypothetical kind of thing. People are doing it all over the world. And so it's really emerging as an important, the implications of assisted migration are real, and they're affecting, native forest biodiversity. And my real perspective is protecting native forests and native forest biodiversity, I guess. And so, from where we come from in the forest pathology, forest entomology world, we're really worried about sort of three key things with assisted migration that we've heard a little bit about today, but not a lot of depth on. And that would be, you know, the potential for assisted migration to transport pests, non-native invasive pests, the impacts of what are local pests on introduced species, or what we might call naive species that haven't been exposed to these pests before. And this can happen within the range, like within the range of Douglas fir. This is occurring when you move things up. They may or may not have experienced a pest that is in the northern part of the range and not in the south. And then a third thing that we actually have observed is that in maladapted plantings, so we might make these plantings and then the plants don't do well. They may get some insects or disease persisting in those populations because they're maladapted, and then those maladapted plants can allow the buildup of pathogens and inoculum that could then spread into native populations if the climate shifts and allows, you know, these insects and disease to move into these populations. So those are just some of the concerns that we have with assisted migration. And so we've developed, you know, some ideas, probably very idealistically, about what the principles we might have and follow for assisted migration. And at some, if we have time, we can share those or talk about them more. But I really do believe that we need a set of principles that people should think about, if not always follow, because they might be too idealistic or whatever, but really should think about before making decisions for doing assisted migration planting.
Great, thanks, Dave. And Kira actually just put a link to some of those principles in the chat, and I know that will be available in the information that we share after this meeting as well. Getting started with a little bit more of a general question, and two of you already touched on this in your introduction. We've been talking about different types of assisted migration, whether it's seed migration or range expansion or species migration. Are there different ethical considerations based on the different types of assisted migration? And I'll open that up to the floor for whoever wants to address that first.
Well, if you don't mind, I'll take a shot at it first. Some of the things that we consider is that, you know, if climate is changing and we're starting to see tree mortality associated with that, you know, we talk about Douglas fir in Southern Oregon, for example, at the lower elevations is really getting hammered right now. Western red cedar in Washington, Western hemlock. There are survivors of these events. You know, it's not a complete wipeout, at least yet. And, you know, we do know, though, with the heat dome and with the fire weather we had last Labor Day in 2020, you know, that perhaps what we can conceive of happening, we can't conceive of what's really going to be happening, because it just doesn't fit with anything that has happened previously. But on the other hand, we do see survivors. And so these survivors may have the genetic capacity to build new populations that are resilient to these disturbances, such as drought, heat, fire, those kind of things. So when you do move novel populations into a region, you could potentially be swamping out the resilience or resistance that the native populations are naturally being pushed to, because these disturbances can, you know, disturbances like a major drought or major heat event or whatever really can shift the population structure of local populations, and they may be pushing it to more resilient type, genetics. And so when you're moving in populations from outside the realm, you know, you can potentially swamp this resilience and and anyway, so that's just one thing that comes to mind when I think about these kind of things.
I guess I associate ethics with risk and responsibility as well. And Claire opened by asking, what is it, that we value about these species? Why are we doing this? And I don't speak on behalf of all of us, but I think we're doing it not only for the intrinsic value of the species or the ecological value of the species, but we're doing it to learn. And so you could say it's maybe unethical or less ethical or less responsible to take action without learning. And I think everyone has mentioned the importance of, when we can, to start out with something small scale and less risky, because there's learning in these assisted migrations. And if there is a way to do it within an experimental frame and to do it in a less risky way, that's probably the way to go. And that's maybe less risky and more ethical. So that's one thing. And another thing is, it doesn't begin, just as the restoration paradigm is changing from being one where it's a one-off, we go in and we restore something and we're done and we're in maintenance mode. And I believe that paradigm is changing to be something that's more gradual and more continuous and needs to be monitored. We need to make a commitment, I think, or I think it's more ethical and less risky to not only do small scale staged introductions or movements, but to make a commitment to monitoring, that we need to continue to learn from this, because all the lessons might not be in the first year or two. And that's a big commitment, financially and institutionally, to keep learning from this and apply that information back to new considerations. And I don't know how many of you read The Little Prince from Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, but there's a line in there, something about when we domesticate something, we're forever responsible for it. So I think that for me, the ethics also gets to when we decide to do one of these movements that seems like a big, bold move, you know, as long as we've thought it through as well as we can, embrace the knowledge from whoever can contribute, and we're committed to monitoring it and seeing it through, then, you know, we're probably being pretty ethical in our approach. But we need to make that commitment that we're not just putting it out there and it may or may not survive, but we're responsible for what happens later on. And we should be thinking about what that kind of commitment and responsibility means in the long term.
So I think that's really interesting, and it kind of raises, I think, a sort of tension between different values that might be important here, because if part of what, I mean, so if the thought is, well, we've planted these trees and therefore we should take responsibility for whether they flourish and we should monitor them, essentially they have become kind of domesticated trees. And so if one of the thoughts about doing something like this is, well, once we plant them and let them go, they can kind of rewild. So we will have wild forests eventually. That idea seems in tension with the thought of kind of monitoring and domestication. So I'm wondering what people think about that, and which of those values seems more important, and whether perhaps it's, you know, once you've planted a forest by assisted migration, it can't ever be wild. So, you know, in that case, monitoring for its success would be a better approach.
I think the hope is that it will rewild, but it's something we don't know. But
yeah, I think that does get at why are we, you know, the question on why are we doing assisted migration. And one is, do we just want green trees outside the window that are living, or, you know, are we trying to save natural forests? Are we trying to, you know, grow trees for economic purposes? You know, it really gets at what the point of the assisted migration really is. And is it to save a species? Is it to save the forest? Is it to save native biodiversity? Or is it, you know, because there's more to the forest than just the trees? And, you know, when you shift species composition, especially for novel species, you know, the local wildlife, insects, various things, you know, there's implications for all of that. And so I think it gets at, you know, what are you trying to save? And, you know, in terms of why you're doing the assisted migration? Is it, you know, just to have green trees, or what?
And I'll just build on that. I've been having these thoughts, which is, you know, how ethical has our management of our forest been in the last 100 years? And are part of the repercussions we're seeing on the ground due to our harvest methods and our replanting strategies? And do we have an obligation to consider the ethics of how we manage our forests in this conversation? And, you know, here in Eastern Washington, on days like we've had these last couple of days, I know, for example, one of our tribes has planted 1 million trees this year. I'm really concerned about whether or not those trees are going to survive this week. And so I would personally much rather be a 100-year-old tree with deep roots than a seedling this week. I can assure you that. So do we need to rethink our management? Is clear cutting and replanting single species the right way to go? Or do we have an obligation to start rethinking how we manage our forests and contemplate how climate change factors into that? And is selective harvest a more sustainable approach? And again, from my perspective, that's just another angle to tackle as we investigate these conversations and really study this, is to consider those multiple variables. And I'm sure there's not enough time, money, and man and woman power out there to really answer these questions adequately before we jump into moving this plant material. But the more we can entice universities and graduate students and organizations and entities to really start investigating these questions, I think the better off we would be in the long run. So I think the ethics of our management is something to factor in.
And this is kind of bringing in two different approaches to figuring out what is the end goal. Several of you have mentioned kind of the idea of a natural ecosystem, and then several of you have mentioned history or cultural considerations. And I know there was a question in the chat, given some of the historical harms that have been inflicted on Indigenous communities in particular, which is definitely top of mind given some of the stories we've seen in the news lately about the boarding schools. How can we balance some of those? I mean, it's an incredibly complex question. How can we balance some of those cultural considerations along with the natural considerations for what those end goals should be, and who should be involved in making those decisions? Just to give you a very easy softball question.
Well, I mean, I can take a shot at that too. I think there's probably others that are more qualified to answer that. But, you know, in the US, obviously it's the landowners that make the decisions about their properties, be it the federal government, the state, or private and industry. And of course, there's a lot of give and take there, but there's no rules against assisted migration. There's no rules against planting one thing or another on your property. The forestry vegetation rules are all about, you know, establishing plantations free to grow by, you know, a certain number of years and these kind of things. So I think the decisions are really, you know, even though they might have implications beyond your ownership, the decisions at this time are really made by the landowners and the people managing any given parcels of land. And I don't know how to, you know, I don't know that that should change or would change under any future scenarios.
Yeah, and Dave, I would just add that that's true for the vast majority of species, I'm sure. In my world here in California, because we manage listed species and we manage about, not just California, we have preserves in Washington and Oregon as well. And we have over 60 species that are threatened or endangered at the state or federal levels. So of course, we would need to get permits to move them around at all. In fact, with the San Diego thorn mint that I mentioned earlier, even after doing a genetic study and having information, we didn't propose to move them from one general location to another, or anything that we might call a population, or would qualify, I think, as assisted migration. We just decided we would expand a local population from one clay lens to another. So we're assisting them. We're not relying on natural dispersal, but we just wanted to spread the seed out a little bit to help the local populations grow. And we needed to get permission from the California Department of Fish and Wildlife to do that. But again, that's just within the realm of listed species. And I do understand that that's not usually what we're talking about when we have a focus on a species.
Yeah, I'll just segue into this. I'm not sure it's answering the question, but one of our biggest fears about assisted migration is not the coordinated efforts that, like Scott was talking about, where you have you do some modeling, and then you do some field trials, and then you make the basis of your choices on the field trials and that kind of thing. What we're most worried about in the pathology world and the insect world is that, someone goes to California, digs up some plants and then transports the soil, the litter, and the plant to Washington and plants it in their yard or in their forest, hoping to, build resilience in their forest. And of course, I'll just say this about California, it's a real Phytophthora wonderland. And those Phytophthora diseases are easily transported in soil and on plant parts. So, that kind of assisted migration where it's done by citizens just feeling like they want to help, they could actually be transporting, pathogens and insects. The Japanese beetle outbreak that's occurring in Portland right now, I believe, is a result of somebody from the East digging up plants in their yard and transporting the larvae in the soil and then planting those plants in Oregon. And now we have, a Japanese beetle outbreak in Portland. So, those kind of things are happening. And those are some of the things that are most worrisome, as opposed to coordinated, thoughtful, researched efforts at, that depend on multi-level testing and, models and that kind of thing. So there's kind of a big variation in exactly what is being assisted and how it's being assisted and that kind of thing. So that emerges as something that's really important in my mind, is how these trials are really being done, or is the media and all the excitement around assisted migration getting people to just go out and dig stuff up and move it. And that's a kind of a scary scenario for us.
So I have a question for my fellow panelists. So do you think there should be more or less regulation around assisted migration? Because it sounds like Deborah may have encountered kind of too much and David may have encountered too little. I don't, it sounds like there's not, that in some contexts, you have to do, there are lots of hurdles, and in other contexts, there's none at all. So, you can just move something. If you don't tell anyone, you just take it from one place and plant it in another, which I think is what happened in the first case of anything that was ever moved. I now can't remember what the name of the tree was that was moved in North Carolina, I think. So I'm just wondering what people think about regulation and whether there's actually a kind of ethical imperative to have more regulation or to reduce it in some areas.
Ooh, that's a dicey one. Regulation is not, big. Regulation is really not a lot of people aren't happy about more regulations. I guess I should just say that. But I think that we do have quarantines for, transporting quarantined organisms, insects and diseases that might have a foothold somewhere that can't be moved. And we do have quarantines around that. But I think implementing regulations around assisted migration would be really fraught with difficulty and would probably get a lot of blowback. Our nurseries and various other growers around, they sell beyond the borders of Oregon and or Washington or whatever. And so my gut is I'd like to see more regulation, but the reality is I don't think that's possible, to be honest. I don't know what the other panelists think about that. But.
Well, maybe we want to differentiate between like principles of professional conduct that as a conservation community we would agree on, that are science-based and experience-based, and we should embrace those not only amongst ourselves when we're engaged in assisted migration, but conduct outreach. So if there are Johnny Appleseeds and people doing things on their own, at least we've made some effort towards informing them of repercussion. But that's different. I think when we say regulation, we think of government and the regulators, and that takes it out of the hands of all of us in the conservation community, and maybe slows down to some extent adaptively managing those regulations with new information and so forth. So we're talking about some control and some principles and how to best manage with risk. And we can do that more easily within our conservation community because maybe we all have some basic acceptance of science or logic, and then it's more difficult to reach out to a more diverse general public where they can move things around as well.
Yeah, I just think it'd be impossible, almost impossible to regulate. I mean, if somebody moving from, the southeast to the west or something like that, they have favorite plants and various things, and trying to, outlaw that, I think would be difficult. Although you get to California and at the border there, you're going to hit an inspection station and they're going to say, no, you can't bring this plant, that plant, or this fruit. They actually picked up, emerald ash borer at one of those stations in California, when they were. So there are states that can regulate things to protect their industries. So there is some, framework for that. Whether that would, how that would actually work out for forest restoration and assisted migration, I'm not sure, but we do have a set of principles that we wrote up. If anybody would like to take a look at those right now, I do have a slide. Do you want to look at those? Or I think we only have a couple of minutes left, so maybe that's people can look at that if they'd like to. But we did develop some ideas around principles, and I think the problem is we haven't really floated those to the entire community yet. So it's sort of a list that was made up in by a few people that thought these would be important. But at some point it would be really nice to get an agreed upon set of principles for assisted migration within the community here. Is that getting to your question, Claire? I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. I mean, that kind of raises the question of what's the community that should be kind of consulted and involved in discussions about this. And so some of the literature on assisted migration expresses worry that in terms of the pursuit of assisted migration, it's the kind of vision of some part of the conservation community, but it may not be something that members of the general public or other kinds of communities or marginalized communities or so, and they may have different visions of the future of forests and so on. And that, there needs to be kind of wider citizen discussion about what we want forests to look like in the future. Whether we should move things to move species rather than lose them, and that there hasn't really been enough of a broad discussion about, well, this is, I guess, an example of actually trying to do that, but there hasn't been a very broad discussion about that to get kind of diverse views and to be more inclusive about who's talking about the future of forests. So rather, I mean, while I think professional ideas are really important, that professional conduct and so on is good, there also needs to be, I think, a broader discussion too.
I just add, I agree with that. And I see a real opportunity with the folks that are coming together here today for follow-up conversations. Obviously, there's so much, we could tackle this for a whole day, but specifically to the principles issue, I think that would be time well spent bringing this group back together and evaluating, you could share, we could all refer to the principles you've developed and use that as a starting point. And ultimately, coming to some conclusion on appropriate principles to share with the region, and then thinking too about more about the education and outreach piece. And I think looking to examples like the work that's been done on zebra and quagga mussels, and as you travel across the country now, going from state to state and seeing that educational signage and awareness being raised. And to your point about California, it wouldn't be much to add if it's not already there, the movement of plant material, but we could add more education and information at crossings at state entries regarding plant materials. So I think, in my opinion, today's the start of this conversation, and I really hope we can continue to build on this momentum and actually produce product that can help our regions and help folks, the tribes that I work for, better navigate these questions. So.
And then the comments, there seems to be pretty broad support for having some kind of professional ethics code. We did add in the comments some of the principles that Dave was referring to. So that's in the comments currently and will be sent around after the discussion. And there was also a reference to the Code of Ethics for the Society for Ecological Restoration. That link is also in the comments. And there was also a suggestion about collaborating with groups like the Native Plant Societies and or Plant Right for the messaging and outreach for some of those principles to make sure they're being a bit more broadly disseminated. To change tack just a tiny bit, we've been talking about the risks of assisted migration, but I also wanted to float the idea of risks of inaction, especially as Brad and Kim were mentioning in the comments. We're not working in a pristine environment for the ecology and the ecological context that we're working in. We're working in a context of climate change and emissions from climate change, and we're also working in altered landscapes, especially in urban areas. How do we balance the risks of action versus inaction, especially in areas that can no longer be considered natural?
I'd like to offer just a different, it's always provocative when we have either or, black and white kind of, do you act or do you not act? And I was even a co-author once on a paper called, The Fear of Failure, that examined different levels of risk that's felt by different cultures, like regulatory culture and conservation practitioner culture and so forth. But I'd like to propose that it's not quite a dichotomy. That is, inaction to me means not even thinking about it, like doing nothing. And I don't think that is a position that we take, that we're just going to say we're not even going to think about it. But action means thinking about it like we are today, deciding if there's some critical information that's needed and making some effort towards getting that information, whether it's research or something else, and planning and bringing together the team needed to have a 360-degree look at decisions and implementing, thinking through and taking appropriate steps at all of the implementation and doing it right, and then moving things. So to me, the action isn't just moving things on the ground, but thinking about it, and planning and getting additional information if that's the rate limiting step. And I think we're doing that. And there's the risk of doing that front part before we actually get to physically moving around. There's still risk to that. It means, you know, all of our time is limited. So we're allocating resource to that thought process and that planning and that research and those conversations instead of something else.
Yeah,
So,
I want to say, yeah, I think that's a great, I just want to say, I think that's a great point, right? I mean, deciding, and if you decided not to do something, that's not an inaction, it's an action. It's just an action that doesn't involve doing, you know, moving something, but, you know, it's still something that you've thought about and made a decision about. So sorry, I interrupted you.
very productively, thank you.
Well, I would also say that, you know, all the foresters, restoration specialists, everybody in the audience, I suspect, is, you know, action is the name of the game. You know, they're doing restoration, they're doing reforestation, they're doing all of that. And so the question is, you know, are they, you know, is the inaction, if they aren't taking into account climate change, you know, is that inaction? You know, if they're planting with local seed sources instead of using assisted migration, is that inaction? You know, I'm not sure it is. I think, you know, obviously things are changing, but most of these practitioners and, you know, out there, it's this audience, I suspect, is doing that. And when they do have failures in plantings or various other things, they shift gears, they accommodate, they plant something new or something else, or, you know, so it's sort of like a action group that is here, and inaction isn't something that is even contemplated, you know, from that perspective. But I'd say, you know, are you accommodating climate change, and how do you do that? I think the questions are still out there on how to do that. You know, it might be that we could find ways to silviculturally manipulate stands to rather, you know, to sort of be more resilient to heat effects or drought or something like that, where you don't necessarily need to shift the species composition. You know, you just need to, you could manipulate stand structures to get to the same end. Now, however, when you look at these 100-year projections, you know, I mean, I go outside and I look at the hill slope, and, you know, the word from these projections is all those trees I'm looking at are going to be dead in 100 years. And you know, I personally don't know how to handle that. You know, I can't imagine making the shift now thinking that I'm going to know what's going to be happening in 100 years, you know? So I like the idea of the baby steps, the working our way through this, making, you know, experiments and then responding and that kind of thing. Excuse me, I didn't mean to take up all the remaining time. Marc, I'm sure.
No, not much to add. You know, I think the key thing to add for me is that you've basically just said it, that patient approach and being really thoughtful. I mean, here we are in Eastern Washington at 117, you know, 109 to 117 degrees, while Phoenix is at 103. So we can make a lot of assumptions, but the realities of what's going to play out is still unknown. So we have to be really malleable and open. And that's why the research is critical. And I know, for example, there's a study that's underway from the British Columbia Ministry of Forests, where they've moved 15 tree species further north in the range into areas where they weren't currently growing to better understand their success. I mean, that's just one example regionally over here in British Columbia province. So again, I just think it's imperative to look at all the regional work that's going on and try to pull all that data together into a concise and digestible format where you could potentially go research by tree species, look to the work that's already being done and the examples of success and failure, and then start to coalesce around a strategy to build upon that and take that patient approach. That might very well, start as range expansion as opposed to complete movement of species to whole new ranges as an interim step to be patient as we approach this.
Absolutely. And I know we're getting towards the end of time, so I just wanted to share one final kind of wrap-up question to get at what our panelists here are thinking as priority goals for how they want to see the ethics evolving around this in the future. Michael Nelson put in the comments, it seems like appealing to values like wildness and naturalness quickly leads us to an ethical impasse. What about some of the other ethical notions or concepts like justice, virtues like care, respect, and integrity? Wanted to open that up to the panelists as a final question. What are some of the ethical notions and concepts that you're really holding close as you're moving forward with this? And what do you think will be your focus in your work moving forwards around assisted migration?
Well, mine is really, protecting native biodiversity. That's the key ethic that I think is important for us. And so I think, in urban forests and in plantation forests, assisted migration has been going on for years and years and years, it's something that I think just, that's, we have those mix of species. People have been moving species around for a while, but when we move into the natural or native forests and the biodiversity that is there, when we start moving trees and trees only, you've still got a lot of other biodiversity out there. And, what is the context of moving the trees, and are the trees going to completely change the situation for biodiversity? Are you going to drive things to extinction just to save trees? I don't know, but that's just out there. I think I would just put that question out there.
So I saw that great question where Michael raised some other kinds of values that we haven't really talked about, and I agree that those are really important. So I think justice is something that we haven't specifically talked about, and there are lots of different kinds of justice that might be relevant for thinking about this question. So participative justice, who's involved in these discussions, who's actually going to be making decisions and so on. And then several people have said in the chat, we need to think about future people. And so I think thinking about, well, what would be just to future generations, because trees are so long lived. So even trees that we plant now will all be dead by the time that they're mature. So, what does it mean for the future for us to be carrying out assisted migration? So I think those are really important questions about justice. And then there's also the question about humility. What would it be humble to do in the context of assisted migration? I think that's really difficult because, sometimes people think that these planned interventions are, hubristic. That's one of the reasons people object to something like assisted migration. And yet when species are disappearing and ecosystems are disappearing, maybe the humble thing to do is to think about how we can best make recompense and try to bring back some things that we're losing. So I think it's kind of unclear what to think about humility. So those are really important questions. So thanks for that, Michael.
And I would just say, like, within my current sphere of influence, it is an environment where we're managing and hopefully helping with the recovery of species on the edge, species that have sunk to the level of being threatened or endangered. And even though those species, so that is already a rare environment, and somehow society has decided that those species that are on the edge of extinction, they deserve special attention and they deserve special resources. A lot of resources go into their regulation and a lot of resources go into their management. But maybe within that realm of managing those listed species and doing some assisted migration from those, we do have the benefit of an environment in which we can learn more about assisted migration and perhaps take less risk in some cases, because many of those listed species, or at least the 60 or so within our preserves in Washington, Oregon, and California, are not these high stature species, these big ecosystem dominating or defining species. They're little species that many of us may not even have heard of. And so maybe moving some of those around, again, because these species do command more than their maybe fair share of resources, we can learn something, and also maybe at less risk because they have less ecosystem impact as individual species. So just a thought there.
And the only thing I'd add is I think ideally, and this is idealistic, but is to do our best to mimic nature. Nature is the ultimate expert at this. You know, ranges have contracted and expanded for millions of years. I mean, it blows your mind when you stand next to a 10-foot stump of a sequoia tree in North Dakota that lived there millions of years ago, and somehow that sequoia range has been able to expand and contract and find a way to survive, but also recognizing that humans have put up a lot of physical roadblocks now, ecological roadblocks, and now climate roadblocks. So what can we learn from nature? What can we learn from traditional ecological knowledge? What can we do to learn from the way the planet has caretaken itself for all these millions of years, and do our best to mimic that and not start leapfrogging over some of these natural processes without at least exploring how to best mimic nature to get this job done.
And I think that is a perfect note to end on. So thank you, all four of you, for your time. This is a really interesting discussion, and I'm sure the start of many more. And thanks to all of our participants for joining as well. We are going to have the recording of this available up online, and we'll share that around. And we'll also have some more resources in the forthcoming newsletter for the Treeline Coalition. Thanks so much to everyone, and hope you have a